Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. We're pleased to have as our guest speaker today Dr. Len Tashman, and he'll be presenting Improving Forecast Practice, Lessons from Experience and Research. My name is Eric Stellwagen and I'll be the moderator today. I'll introduce Len in a minute, but first I want to go through a couple of logistics about how we run the webinar. The webinar will run approximately 45 to 50 minutes, and we'll be saving some time at the end for questions and answers. During the webinar, you can submit questions using the control panel on your screen, and you can submit them at any time during the webinar. I'll be monitoring these questions throughout the webinar and compile a list for Len for the Q&A at the end. We'll also take questions submitted during the session, the Q&A session itself. We'll try to address as many questions as possible, but if we don't get to your question, don't worry. We'll send you a follow-up email with a reply after the conclusion of the webinar. We'll also be taping this webinar, and we'll be emailing you a link to the video sometime next week. Please advance the slide. So again, you'll receive an email once the video is ready. It'll also be posted on our website. And incidentally, we have a full archive of all the past webinars that we have presented. They're free, and they're a great way to catch up on any past webinars you may have missed. So be sure to check out forecastpro.com, the webinar archive, if you're interested. Next slide, please. Okay, so now it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Len Tashman. Len is a professor emeritus of business administration at the University of Vermont. For his excellence in teaching, the university awarded him the Cropch Maurice Award for outstanding teaching, and he also received the MBA Association's recognition as Professor of the Year on 4 separate occasions. He's internationally recognized for his expertise in forecasting. He is the editor-in-chief and actually the founder of Foresight, the International Journal of Applied Forecasting. He's co-authored several books on forecasting and has published numerous articles in journals such as the International Journal of Forecasting, the Journal of Forecasting, Foresight, of course, and the Journal of Business Forecasting, as well as others. He's taught numerous forecasting workshops and consulted widely in the field of business forecasting, so we're truly lucky to have him as a presenter today. And now, without any further ado, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Len, and he'll be presenting Improving Forecast Practice, Lessons from Experience and Research.
Well, thanks so much, Eric. So welcome, everyone, the Foresight Forecast Pro people, Foresight readers, guests from the public. I'm sitting here now in the Rocky Mountains, about a half an hour west of Denver, looking at the first snow dusting of the season, and feeling envious for all of those of you who are still enjoying Indian summer and fall. As I understand, back in New England, it's quite warm. So it's a pleasure to be talking to you, and I hope you benefit from this discussion. Let's start by noting that over the millennia, forecasting has been a risky business. In Dante's Inferno, we received the warning, "Here are the souls of all of us, the forecasters, who attempted by forbidden arts to look into the future. We are wretches whose sins are reversed upon us. Our punishment is to have our heads turned backwards on our bodies, and with our eyes blinded with tears, to be compelled to walk backwards through all eternity." That sounds much harsher than any penalty you would face for inaccuracy in your forecasts. In 357 AD, the Emperor Constantius issued a decree forbidding anyone to consult a soothsayer, a mathematician, or a forecaster. Quote, "May curiosity to foretell the future be silenced forever." And forecasting often doesn't pay. In 1736, England passed a law making it an offense to charge money for predictions. The punishment was 3 months imprisonment with hard labor. Some have said that forecasting is the second oldest profession, whether that's true or not. The modern era, I believe, of business forecasting dates back 30, 40 years. We have, however, made a great deal of progress in this century alone. Let me highlight just a few things. This, in the last 15 to 20 years, we've seen truly collaborative processes emerge. Internally, sales and operations planning. Externally, that is coordinating among supply chain partners, we've seen vendor-managed inventories, collaborative planning, forecasting, and replenishment. So these are pretty standard now, although some companies have much improvement necessary to implement. We've seen great advances in forecasting methods, new attention to bad data, short time series, data interrupted but missing information, volatile series. We've learned how to do simulations to assess uncertainty. And a bullet I should have put in here is we've made enormous advances in what we call automatic forecasting algorithms, increasing our confidence in the ability of our systems to work with us to achieve the best forecast possible. We've learned how to do flexible hierarchies based on location, based on product, based on time. And there have been major advances in software support. It's now standard to have a system linking forecasting, planning, and supply chain functions. So this is great progress over the course of the 21st century. But the progress has not impacted every organization. We see small and medium companies, some small and medium companies that still rely on spreadsheets as a primary forecasting solution. I probably have written over the last 25 or 30 years how bad an idea this is, but it continues. That's the reality. Some large companies we know have ERPs, but some of the forecasting engines therein are far behind the state of the art. Some we found date back to the 1980s. Time to upgrade. Too often we've learned the forecasting process is decoupled from inventory management, which is remarkable when you think about it, since this is one of the primary purposes of forecasts for operations. This decoupling has led to potentially significant errors in the calculation of safety stock and especially in the determination of service levels, something that needs to be looked into. Functional biases persist, silos in organizations. Some allow self-interest, undocumented judgment, inadequate statistical to undermine forecast accuracy. So there we've made advances. We still have issues to deal with. So what are these issues? I've taken a look at the past generation of publications as well as what I've learned from talking and working with forecasting practitioners. We have a set of principles that at minimum are provocative for you to think about and worthy of further consideration. And so I have organized these into three groups. The general principles that we have for modeling, that is the generation of forecasts. The principles for assessing performance, that is forecast accuracy, setting accuracy goals, benchmarking, and principles for managing the process. And that includes ensuring behaviors that don't compromise the process. So I'll give you the flavor of each of these principles. There are so many more that I can't cover in the time of one webinar. So let's start with some tried and true principles for generating forecasts. First, good practice in forecasting requires man-machine introduction. We used to refer to this as cybernetics, man-machine interaction. You can rely on your software to automatically do the job for you, to select the model, generate the forecast, when the data are clean, when my word is plain vanilla. But there are, and much data are really special cases that require some attention from you yourself. What are these cases? If you're dealing with short histories, if you're dealing with products that are replenishment, replacements for what came before, the recognition of items that you plan to phase out, the identification of outliers and other non-recurring events, such as promotions and how to adjust for them. Organizing an effective product hierarchy, one that makes sense for your own organization. So these are the cases where some input from you helps or is invaluable. Okay. Second, consider the case of data, time series of data, historical time series, which are too short, not enough data to expect good forecasts by directly extrapolating this time series. For example, you have a new product and only 7 months of data and you think it might be seasonal, but you don't have enough information to measure that seasonality. So one thing we've learned that is when your product histories don't live up to the standards we need for direct modeling, it can be a good idea to model analogous or aggregate series. An aggregate series, for example, your product is part of a product family. An analogous series, you have a new product whose characteristics seem to be very similar to one in which you do have an adequate history. So you model these series and you transfer the resulting patterns to the product in question. Sometimes we refer in a hierarchy to this capability as top-down forecasting or top-down reconciliation. Software does not typically do this automatically, but has the facility to be instructed to do so. So that's something to recognize. Third principle for modeling, be eclectic. There rarely is a single best model which you can rely on over time, your tried and true model. It pays to try things in different ways. If you try to make forecasts in several independent ways, you can learn by comparing the differences. If all the forecasts from independent modeling approaches are similar, this gives you confidence that your picture for the future is differences. Ask why. What are some models taking into account that the others are not? That's called error feedback. Finally, the fourth and final principle I'll cite for generating forecasts, the role of judgment. Essentially, judgment is explicit or implicit in basically all statistical forecasts. You're using it, you're exercising judgment even when you decide to rely on your automatic forecasting function in your software. Your judgment is to allow the software to do it. What we've learned is that there needs to be restraint in the exercise of judgment, especially when you're using judgment to adjust the statistical forecast, as most organizations do. So here's some food for thought. Only adjust statistical forecasts when you have important extra information about forthcoming events. The key word here is extra information, information that was not available to your software system when issuing the forecasts. Second, keep, if you can, a formal record of the judgmental adjustments. At least you can try to do this for major items. Of course, it's probably not feasible to do it for hundreds or thousands of items, but for your major categories, you should, it's worthwhile to do this. And a suggestion that's been made in the research is if your executives are asking for additional adjustments above and beyond those that seem to come from the people closer to the forecasting planning function, ask them to sign off on these so you know who the culprit is when things don't go right. Okay, let's go to the second set of principles, which have to do with your measuring forecasting accuracy and setting accuracy goals. The first principle, a good model fit to your historical data, which we call in-sample fit, is not a reliable indicator of the forecast accuracy you can expect in the future. Model fit means that the model that's been selected can accurately track the historical data that was used to fit the model. But to assess forecasting accuracy, you must look beyond the historical data. You must perform what we call out-of-sample tests. There are many ways to do this. Holdout samples, for example, say you have 4 years of monthly data. You could use the first 3 years to select a model, and then the holdout sample would be the final 12 months. The final year, test the accuracy of your model on that holdout sample. You could use real-time measurement of accuracy, waiting to see how the forecasts work out, and you could use retrospective evaluations in which you see how the forecasts you made for any 1 month varied from the time you made them 2 years ago to the time you made it a year ago to the time you made it 3 months ago, and so on. So there are many ways to assess forecast accuracy. It often pays to do it more than one way. But accuracy is not the be-all and end-all forecasting performance and achieve cost saving. It's not the bottom line. We do need accuracy metrics, but we need the bottom line, the cost of forecast error. How do our forecast models affect inventory performance, customer service, and ultimately our profitability? That's the ultimate goal. Unfortunately, and this is perhaps the most regrettable point that I have to make, there is no simple equation. It doesn't matter what you hear on some websites. There's no simple equation that translates forecast error, reduction in forecast error, into improvements in inventory. So if you can reduce your forecast error by 10%, how will that convert into improved safety stock, improved service level? No simple formula for that. And you need to realize that, because each organization has to develop its own analytics for making that translation. Hopefully there will be new research on this that will help us in the future. Accuracy goals are often formulated without information on the forecastability of the products in question, leading to unrealistic expectations. Statements like, well, we need to get our forecast error down below 1%, or below 10%, or below 30%. What does that mean if you don't know how forecastable your product is? So here are the key questions you need to ask when assessing forecasting accuracy. What degree of accuracy improvements is achievable? What's the best you can do? What steps can you take to reach your potential? For this, you need to understand your product's forecastability DNA. What about the characteristics of this product that make it more or less forecastable? For example, its volume, its variability over time, the lead time of your forecast, whether it's promoted or not, the number of customers. Some studying needs to be done to understand the product's DNA so you could determine how forecastable it is. We try to benchmark to see how well we're doing, and sometimes companies turn to external surveys. This is, with almost no exceptions, a mistake. It's virtually impossible to obtain valid benchmarks from external surveys of forecast accuracy. There are just too many sources of incomparability between your organization and the others used in the survey. And look at that list. We published an article a decade ago on benchmarking, and let me just quote the bottom line here from the author. The quest for external forecasting benchmarks is futile. Benchmarking rather should be driven not by external accuracy targets, but by knowledge of what constitutes good forecasting practice. Our focus should be on the processes to be changed instead of the elusive goal of achieving a particular mate. In other words, internal assessment of benchmarking. Are you improving over time? That quote ended with the line, achieving a particular mate. Let's talk about the mate for a minute. Everybody knows what this is. Mean absolute percentage error. So a MAPE of 12% for a product says, on the average, our forecasts were off by 12%. So how could that be easier to understand accuracy than to rely on the MAPE? The MAPE can be very misleading in particular situations, and these need to be recognized. Data with spikes, intermittent data with zeros in the demand, low volume data, the MAPE can explode and give you a misleading picture of accuracy. You shouldn't use the MAPE to compare forecasting performance across different product groups or different divisions or different companies. Why? Because the forecastability of different products and areas is different. And you can't use the MAPE for detecting biases, tendencies to under-forecast too often or over-forecast too often. Look into it. But we have alternatives which are safer. We have what we call scaled error metrics, similar to the MAPE, but which are safer to use. My favorite is called the MAD over the mean. The MAD is the mean absolute deviation or mean absolute error. And the mean is the average of your historical data. The MAD over the mean tells you your error as an average of your, the error as a fraction of your average historical value. Another one is the MACE, mean absolute scaled error. These metrics are safer to use when you have problem time series and form a more solid basis for benchmarking. As far as bias detection goes, best done looking at graphs rather than any particular numerical metric. So if these are things you don't know about, I would look into them. Another principle of accuracy has to do with single point forecasts. They're often a necessary evil. I mean, operations demands precise estimates of product requirements. But the model forecasts often have wide margins for error. Well, the result is tension. And so each side has responsibilities. The forecasters need to understand the margins for error in the forecast. That is, how far off the forecast can be, and be able to explain this to the decision makers. The forecasters need to highlight the risks associated with the point forecasters. So at least it's all out on the table that that single point forecast you make is very likely to be wrong, and here's how wrong it can be. How do you highlight the risks? Here are a couple of good ways we've learned to do it. Something called probability fan charts. These describe the distributions of possible outcomes. Another way is scenarios based on what we call structured judgment, somehow getting expert opinion that is validated before it's used. Okay, so those were the principles I wanted to mention regarding forecast accuracy and the benchmarking of accuracy. The third, final category I'll bring up has to do with managing the forecasting process. Now, the first principle is put people first. Focus on people and process before software. Investment in new technology does not automatically make forecasts more accurate. Too often, the technology is purchased before an appropriate forecasting process is in place. Harsh reality. Second, provide proper incentives for accurate forecasting. Try to avoid the silo mentalities that lead to dysfunctional forecasts. For example, hedging, that is the intentional over-forecasting by sales to ensure adequate product, or sandbagging, intentional under-forecasting by sales to set lower expectations, enabling them to meet sales quotas. Avoid these silo mentalities through offering proper incentives for accurate forecasting. Second principle, cultivate openness, especially in the monthly S&OP meetings, but whenever there's a planning session with the forecasters. Give all stakeholders, everyone involved in the process, the green light to put the moose on the table. That is, stakeholders' knowledge and input should be welcomed regardless of the negative implications. Be hard on facts, be soft on people. Judgment is always fallible. There will be misjudgments. They should be treated as opportunities for learning rather than an assessment that the person is a personal failure and can't do the job well enough. That is, which is another way of saying have realistic expectations. Senior management should provide a role model for the behavior it seeks to instill in others. I have heard from spending time with many, many dozens of companies that this is that the forecasters and planners feel that this is a major problem for them. So cultivate openness. Third principle, work to achieve. Why should I trust your forecasts? You're the forecast. Why should I trust your forecasts? Well, we've learned in instilling trust. Are you perceived as striving to provide reliable predictions, or as having a personal agenda? Are you unbiased? That's the first one and probably the biggest. Second, are you considered to be competent? Do you have the requisite skills, the ability? Are you using adequate tools? And third, are you effectively communicating? Do you provide justification for your forecast, the rationale behind them? And do you provide it in a language that the user can understand? So here are some key factors then that violate them, and trust in your forecasts is lost. Final point I'll mention, a principle for managing the process, is properly linking, I like the word recoupling the forecasters, the forecast generators with the forecast users, especially in planning and operations. Build relationships between the providers and the users, that is, between the forecasters and their clients, to improve mutual understanding of the problems and what the calculations mean. Understanding of the data available, of the forecastability, of the need to present the forecast in the appropriate form. Sit down and talk to each other before the forecasts are presented. If you're an inventory manager, track inventory performance, track your forecast errors, and do some analysis of the relationship between the two. Remember I said earlier, there's no simple equation that converts error into performance, safety stock, customer service levels. You need to analyze this on a personal basis for your own organization and at different times. Vendors are sensitive to what their customers want. Less what people like me tell them they need to do, that is the researchers and the journalists, but they are sensitive to their own customers. Lobby your vendors so that you get the best methods, the appropriate algorithms. If something is missing, you have a situation that is important to your organization, but you don't see the software handling it properly, bring it to their attention. You have the best leverage to do so. Okay, those were 3 sets of principles gleaned from experience and research over the last generation. A few thoughts I'd like to close with about the future of this field of ours, forecasting. I'm optimistic. We've seen a lot of progress, and I think we will see continued progress on a number of practical issues. Okay. Forecasting is becoming ever more scientific and broader. We're using new data sources that we couldn't figure out how to use in the future. We didn't know how to deal with metadata from social media until fairly recently. This beast called AI, artificial intelligence, has now some real applications in business forecasting. We have excellent new locational tools like GIS that can be used and linked with other tools to improve the forecasting function. So it's a new and exciting world, but it takes time to digest. I think collaboration will improve. There are network effects here. You see how some companies have benefited from it, and this is a virtuous circle for your own organization. I see good collaborative arrangements spreading and being nurtured as supply chain partners become more interdependent. And hopefully, tensions between the forecast providers and the forecast users will diminish as an understanding between the two groups improves and the quality of the forecast improves. Nothing that can create confidence and interest in the forecasting, the way we do it, as to show that we've had some successes and we know what the users want. Okay. My RX for improving forecasting is a synthesis, a combination of two things: knowledge from experience and knowledge from research. Much practice in the field of forecasting could benefit from knowledge that we have in research if the research is properly disseminated and presented. The researchers need to know what the real problems are out there in the business world to tune their research to these problems and not spend their time in inventing great new methods which have no applicability. So we need to combine these two fields, but there is benefit from learning from the research and learning from experience. The result is better forecasting know-how. Okay. 13 years ago, we created the International Institute of Forecasters, the nonprofit institute that publishes Foresight, and which has been in effect for over 30 years. 13 years ago, we created our first practitioner journal. So Foresight is the International Journal of Applied Forecasting, and it was created with these goals in mind: bring forecasting know-how to business forecasters and to students of forecasting in general. Ensure that advice on forecasting practices is evidence-based and time-tested. Don't tell people to do stuff that you're unsure of. Encourage academic practitioner collaborations. And finally, provide a wake-up call to organizations, to the clueless organizations, that forecasting is important. It can be effective if you have the right people, process, and tools to do so. For those of you, I know many of you are already know about Foresight. For those of you who are new to it, we are making this offer to those who have registered and attended the webinar. We're giving away a complimentary Foresight guidebook and issue of Foresight. We've printed over the years 5 guidebooks. These are compilations of Foresight articles on a particular topic. There's one, our most popular one is the first listed there, called Forecasting Methods Tutorials. Something about over a dozen different methods described in very simple terms. We've had 2 guidebooks on the forecasting process and how to manage it better. We have a guidebook on forecast accuracy measurement, pitfalls to avoid, practices to adopt. And a recent guidebook is on the forecasting of product and temporal hierarchies. And so here's your link, and all of this will be posted and sent to you as well. Here's your link for moving ahead and taking your pick of one of these guidebooks and hopefully familiarizing yourself with whether the Foresight Journal can benefit you in your role as a business forecaster. So I thank you for listening to that presentation. I'm now going to turn this back over to Eric, who will deal with the business side of this webinar.
Okay, thank you, Len. We'll be taking questions and answers, or having a question and answer session shortly. But before we do, I just want to remind people that we have recorded today's webinar, and we will be posting it on the forecastpro.com website. You'll also receive an email sometime next week once it's available to let you know. Next slide, please. Okay, Len, if you can progress the slide, please. There we go. So I also want to mention this is a quarterly webinar series, and we have scheduled our next webinar. It's on forecasting weekly and daily data, and that's often a very more challenging task than forecasting, say, monthly data, for example. So we're going to be going through practical strategies for generating forecasts if you're working with weekly, daily. We'll talk a little bit about hourly as well. Myself, Eric Stellwagen, and my associate, Sarah Darren, will be presenting that webinar. You can visit forecastpro.com and sign up now. I know it's a ways off, but if you're signed up, you'll get reminders, so don't worry about that. And again, as I mentioned earlier, there is also an archive of webinars on forecastpro.com if you want to catch up on some of those. Next slide, please, Len. Okay, for those who've attended our webinars in the past, you know that many of them use the Forecast Pro software as a way of illustrating some of the things that we present during the webinar. In this one, we didn't do so, but I do want to tell people that a lot of what Len talked about here in terms of making sure that you have software that can do, for example, automatic forecasting, custom approaches for what Len was calling plain things that are not plain vanilla, facilities for tracking forecast accuracy and adding judgment and documenting your work. If you're not familiar with Forecast Pro, we'd love to tell you about it. And Len, if you can progress to the next slide, please. Then there's lots of ways that you can learn about it. A good way is actually to get a demonstration, and if you want to, you can even just ask in the chat window, and we'll get back to you. Alternatively, again, lots of good information on forecastpro.com, and any questions can always be answered by contacting us either by email or by phone. Next slide, please. There's also other resources out there for forecasting education and training. So Business Forecast Systems, it's the company that produces Forecast Pro. We offer seminars and workshops. There's also a user conference for those who are using Forecast Pro. We can do things on site. We can go on remotely via WebEx. We have a blog called The Forecast Pro, and you can subscribe to the blog, lots of good information there, and a LinkedIn community as well. So we'd encourage you to explore these resources if they're of interest. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so now we are going to bring Len back on the line here. And we've had some questions that were posed during the webinar, and so I'll ask him the first one. We have a question here that says, if you are going to hold out part of your sample to test accuracy, how much should you hold out?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I've written about providing several rules of thumb to do that. One major issue is what is your forecast horizon? So if your lead time, for example, is 6 months, you wish to assess accuracy at let's just say it's monthly data. You need to assess accuracy for 1 to 6 months ahead. You need to hold out at least 6 months. In general, I recommend holding out data that's slightly more than the longest horizon you need to forecast. If you have a lot of data for products where you have good data, and in my mind, good data means four seasons worth, 4 years worth of seasonal data of monthly or quarterly data. Where you have these 4 years, what I always do is use the first 3 to model, and use the final full year to test the accuracy. This is going to tell you how your model has worked during the most recent year of in your sales history. There's a lot more information about that that's available in our forecast accuracy guidebook. But you need to hold out data at least as long and usefully a little longer than the longest horizon that you're forecasting.
Okay. Another question, somewhat along the same lines and tracking forecast accuracy, says you've mentioned several different ways of tracking forecast accuracy. Is there a best practice way of doing so?
No, they really have. You really get a little bit different information from the three. And I recommend you use all of them. One is the holdout sample. And that's what we just talked about, using the first part of your historical data to build a model, using the more recent part of your historical data to test it. So you learn some things from that you cannot learn from the others. The retrospective evaluations also provide information that's unique to that approach, which would tell you as you move closer, as you make forecasts over time for a particular month or a particular time period, as you move closer and closer to that time period, how is the accuracy changing? Often these results are summarized in what we call a waterfall chart, because you're getting a little bit different information than you are from the holdout samples. And some think that the best way to do things is just a real-time evaluation. Now, by that, you make your forecast, and then you wait till the future has become the present, and you see the problem with that is that, okay, so you're learning in real time, but you can't do the kind of analysis that's possible in real time that you can do with holdout samples or retrospective evaluations. So it's not that these are different practices and one of them is best, it's that all three of them provide their information base, and you can learn by doing all that are feasible.
Very good. Another question here. Can you give examples of incentives for accurate forecasts?
Yes, the direct behavior of the higher-ups in the organization to tell the forecasters and planners that the one thing that they should be doing is to provide a picture of what they think we can sell, what they think the real demand for the product will be, not what we've budgeted for, not what we hope for, not what not what our executives would like to see, but what we really think we can sell. So set the tone from higher up as to what the mission of forecasting is. It's often not clear as to. Second, there can be rewards based on the accuracy of the forecast, as opposed to rewards for achieving particular sales quotas or other goals that can conflict with that of forecast accuracy. One of my editors in the journal, John Mello, has written a series of articles documenting the types of incentives that can be used to keep people on the straight and narrow track, to make forecast accuracy the #1 goal of the mission.
Okay, very good. I think we'll close the questions here. As I mentioned earlier, if you did send a question that we didn't answer as part of the live session, we will be sending you an email reply in the very near future. I want to thank Dr. Len Tashman for agreeing to present today's webinar. I hope that everyone benefited and learned something that you didn't know an hour ago. I'd encourage you again to join us in January for our next webinar. And thanks to everyone for taking an hour out of their day and learning a bit about forecasting. So hope to see everyone here at our next webinar.